All right, Derek, we are here at free agency time, about 5 days away as we record this from the tampering period beginning on Monday. So we are going to dive into the offensive pool of available free agents in this class. We'll be doing the defense tomorrow. So today is all offense all the time. Main takeaways before we start digging into the details of this: if you want good players in free agency, this isn't your year, and increasingly every year is not your year. It's a pretty bleak group when you move beyond the guys that got franchise tagged. We got a lot of old guys, we got a lot of hurt guys, we got a lot of recently released guys, not a ton of high impact second contract big ticket guys in this class.
There really aren't, and we'll do a little bit of a trade portion later in the show, but it almost feels like with each increasing year, we're going to have to do more and more of the show about like potential trade targets. Like, this show might be like 15 to 20% of the show. 3 years from now, it might be half of our show. It's just kind of the way that free agency is headed.
We'll dig into that right now because we got some trades today, or got another trade today. That was kind of what kicked off the news this morning. We're recording this on Wednesday, about 2 p.m. Central Time. So this is something that I essentially woke up to and got a bunch of texts and notifications about. The Bears have traded a 2026 fourth-round pick to the Chiefs for Joe Thuney, making it the second big money Bears acquisition on the interior of the offensive line in as many days. I joked about it earlier today online, but Ben Johnson came in here and was like, we're not doing this anymore. I don't care.
That was the funniest part, is like, I think going in, as soon as they hired him, it was like, okay, we all know they need to fix the interior offensive line. How aggressive are they really going to be about it? Is this, we can slowly develop it, we want our own guys, all this other stuff? Nope, Ben Johnson said, no, we need to fix this today or we're going to have problems.
We talked about it a little bit yesterday with the Jonah Jackson move. I assume they wanted to do this through free agency, but there aren't any available free agents. They were a logical Trey Smith team. The Chiefs franchise tag Trey Smith, now making Thuney available because they've got to save some money somewhere. So I understand this just from a need perspective. The one thing I'll say, people are going to sit back and they're going to look at the fact that now the Bears have Joe Thuney and Jonah Jackson, had neither of them before 2 days ago. They're paying for this stuff. Joe Thuney's making $16 million against the cap this year. He's 32 years old. He's going to be a free agent after this season. Jonah Jackson, and I was talking to some people who know the cap today about the actual details of this. It seems like Jonah Jackson will count for $17.5 million against the cap this year if the Bears don't convert that roster bonus into a signing bonus. So now you're looking at $33 million straight to the 2025 cap for two guards that you had to give up draft capital to go get. They're better than they were 2 days ago, but it's not like they're doing this at a bargain price. It's probably worth it from the Thuney perspective just because you're getting a really good player who's still playing at a high level, but these are not cheap moves the Bears are making. And I think this is also worth mentioning. We can talk about this in a second. This team has traded away a lot of draft picks over the last few years to get veteran players, and eventually that starts to be a slightly dangerous approach. You're living on the razor's edge a little bit, but just from a football perspective, what do you think about the Thuney to the Bears move?
I think it's awesome, man. Like, this actually reminds me a lot of what they've done over the past few days of what the Panthers did last offseason, which is like, oh my God, our offensive line is so bad. Our quarterback is not that big. Caleb is obviously bigger than Bryce Young, but he's still on the shorter end. And so to have like a shored up interior offensive line, I think makes a ton of sense to me. And like you said, they are definitely paying for it, but they're not super committed to either of these in the long term. These are, we need to make sure Caleb has a good environment year one and year two in this offense, facilitate some of his development, make sure that he's the guy. I'm totally okay spending a premium on that. Like, yes, it's expensive. Yes, you're giving up some other stuff, but giving yourself a 15% more chance that Caleb is going to be able to figure this stuff out, that is a totally worth the cost to me. So yeah, very expensive, but totally fine. On the Chiefs end, I'm kind of surprised they did this. And I know the argument for a lot of people is like, oh, well, Thuney's old and all that stuff, and it kind of makes sense to give him up. And I do think that makes some sense, but Thuney like never misses time, which is usually the issue for older guys. So like, even from that angle, I don't know if I love it, but for the Bears, I think it totally makes a lot of sense.
I like this more than the Jonah Jackson move for that reason. So Jackson misses several games a year, even when he's been healthy, and then he played 4 games last year. Joe Thuney misses no time whatsoever. So even if it's a lot to pay for a 32-year-old player, he's a 32-year-old player that's still playing at a really high level, and there's mostly certainty baked in there because of his injury history. The last thing I'll say about the Bears before getting to the Chiefs, here are the players, the veteran players the Bears have traded away picks for in the last 3 years. Keenan Allen, Ryan Bates, Chase Claypool. They traded up. They traded this year's 4th-round pick to move up for Austin Booker in last year's draft and still need an edge rusher. Montez Sweat, Jonah Jackson, Joe Thuney. That's 7 draft picks that they've traded away. And eventually, you need those draft picks. So the fact that they keep doing this is not a place that you want to be. But again, they're much better today than they were 2 days ago. From the Chiefs side of this, I had an interesting conversation at the Combine with somebody who knows Patrick Mahomes well and knows his thinking well. And I think they've landed in a place where they would rather trade Joe Thuney, get a little bit younger with Trey Smith if they have to pick one of them, and then potentially use some of that money on a left tackle instead of a guard. Remember what Tom Brady always used to talk about, how he would rather have the interior of the pocket solidified rather than worrying about pressure on the edge because he thought he could take care of that himself? Mahomes is the opposite. He would rather have the edges solidified and be able to deal with pressure he can see rather than pressure he can feel. And I think that's a conclusion he's kind of always danced around, but came to because of what the Chiefs season felt like this year. So what this says to me is we can only pay one of the guards. We want to go with the younger guy. And we're going to use some of the money that we save in the Thuney trade to potentially upgrade at left tackle. That might be somebody like Ronnie Stanley. That might be somebody on the trade market we can talk about. But that's what this says to me based on how this year went for Mahomes and for that offense.
I think stylistically that does make sense, right? Like Brady was never a mobile guy and his pocket movement was fantastic. So if he had something to step up into, he could make the most of it. And he knew exactly how much space he had and he wasn't going to waste it and all that stuff. Patrick Mahomes is, he's not Lamar Jackson in terms of like he's going to run for 30 yards, but he's one of the best in and around the pocket mobility guys where it's really, really hard to bring him down. So yeah, if a defensive tackle gets through or whatever, it's a little bit easier for him to deal with that. Whereas like if a guy comes screaming off the edge and hits him from the blind side, it's just not as easy for him to deal with. So I think from a stylistic standpoint, it actually does make a lot of sense.
So I think that's why they landed there. And you could just sense how uncomfortable he had gotten in the pocket over the course of this year. That Raider game on Black Friday, that's the one that I'll consistently come back to, where he was visibly frustrated in a way that we just don't see him visibly frustrated. And so my assumption is, again, this is just based on kind of reading the tea leaves a little bit, I think they'll try to move Kingsley Suamataia inside to left guard and then figure out what it's going to look like at left tackle. That's my assumption for how they go about this offseason. Don't know if that's 100% right, but I think I'm leaning that direction. We'll see if they do anything splashy at left tackle over the next week or so, and that'll give us a lot more of an idea of which direction they're trying to head. Some of the other news from today, we've got a whole slew of veteran receivers getting released as teams are trying to save some money. Yesterday was Devontae Adams. Today it was Tyler Lockett and Christian Kirk. We'll talk about all of those guys, but the first thing I wanted to ask you is you look at the older veterans. There's a lot of them in this particular group of free agents. I was talking to a coach this morning. I was asking him about Amari Cooper, and he sent me a GIF of a guy on a walker. And I was like, that's all these guys. Like, you have to pick one of them at some point. But that's the flavor of free agent wide receiver that we have in this group. So if you're looking at the group of Diggs, Adams, Hopkins, Amari Cooper, of those four, who do you like the best just in a vacuum? If you had to pay all of them 2 years, $30 million, which guy would you prefer right now?
I think it's Devontae Adams, and it's not even remotely close. Like he is still a really good player. It's just that like everything that went on, the last year was just not conducive to success for very many wide receivers. And like I'm not saying he's still peak Devontae Adams, right? But he is still 80% of that, and that to me is comfortably better than a lot of these other guys here. So to me, if it was like, if you're paying around the same range for most of these guys, to me, it's pretty comfortably Devontae Adams. He's also, some of these guys can't play outside, and he obviously can.
Adams right now, this is the match we've made since it became clear he was going to be available. I want to see him with the Chargers. Like, to me, it just makes too much sense. West Coast, great weather. He fits with what they already have. Like, the idea of him and Ladd together makes all the sense in the world. I just feel like that is the best landing spot for him. Whether the Chargers want to pay up for a receiver, that's an entirely different conversation. They've given us every indication so far that they would rather prioritize the trenches and get those receivers later based on how they went about the draft last year and even just talking to people in that building last year during training camp. So whether they want to take a big swing swing, we'll see. But to me, Adams just makes so much sense based on where they are and what they need and the resources they have available.
And honestly, maybe this is getting a month and a half ahead of myself. It's a really good offensive line class. If they wanted to take another one, they could. Whereas, like, I don't know how many receivers of Davante Adams' quality, especially in year one, are going to be available in the draft. Go get Davante Adams, man. You know what you're getting. He can play outside, whereas Ladd doesn't have to do it all the time. Like, it makes all the sense in the world.
All right, so moving off of the one you would want in a vacuum, I want to pivot to how you're going to help Drake May in this free agency process, because they need a receiver. And these are the types of receivers we're talking about. There are no second contract 25-year-old ascending receivers to be had in free agency unless you want to give up like a first and change for T. Higgins, which I don't think is going to happen. So among this group of aging players, who do you think is a good fit for the Patriots, and who would you want to see paired with Drake May if you had to pick one of these guys, and you can't pick Davante Adams?
Well, I don't think Davante Adams wants to be on the East Coast anyway, so that was literally what I was going to say, is like it would be Davante Adams, but I don't think he wants to go to New England, so that's kind of off the table. I don't love some of the smaller receivers mostly like partly because that's just not what I love anyway, but also like they have a guy like Pop Douglas already to do some of the underneath like yards after catch, play from the slot type stuff. So to me, either trying to see if you can get the most out of Hopkins outside the numbers again, or Amari Cooper probably make the most sense to me, because you just need to take a dice roll on the guy on the outside. Stylistically, Hopkins makes the most sense just because
I think so too.
Drake will throw it up to you, man. Like that, Drake May, that's what he does. He's going to go give you chances, and Hopkins does still have that in his bag a little bit. So that is probably the most I think would be the one that I want to go for.
I think that makes sense, and I also think that's achievable. Hopkins might be a little bit cheaper than some of these other guys, and I just think even if he doesn't have a ton of juice anymore, just a little bit of certainty, a veteran presence, a big body presence, I actually think that makes a lot of sense for just something that could get the Patriots offense to a workable place, right? Like this point in his career, DeAndre Hopkins isn't a difference maker, but I do think he's reliable enough that he'd be a nice piece for your young quarterback. And he definitely tailed off in the back half of last year, but he was hurt. And maybe that's just going to be how it is at this stage in his career. But if he can get a little bit healthier this offseason, I definitely think he still has enough left in the tank to be a reliable option of the sort that Drake May absolutely needs. All right, let's get to the somewhat underwhelming pool of big ticket items in this free agent class. So these are the guys that are going to get paid, at the top of the market compared to other players available in this group. And that starts to me with Chris Godwin, right? We just talked about how most of these receivers are at 30 or over 30. A lot of them are aging players. Chris Godwin's still only 29, coming off what had been a fantastic season before he suffered that dislocated ankle. So for the most part with these guys, I just want to know what you think of their market and then where you think makes the most sense for them. So where would you like to see Chris Godwin end up at the end of all of this?
Yeah, I think Chris Godwin is, at this point with some of the other free agents falling off the board, kind of going to become the belle of the ball. He had what was maybe his best year of his career, or was starting to last year before obviously he had the dislocated
what was that?
ankle.
What was that one year? Is that 2021 where he had that incredible
year?
He
also was fantastic this year, but this year was like different because I felt like the yards after the catch was just a little bit different than it had ever been for him. And obviously he was fantastic beforehand, but
2019 is that ridiculous season he had. 86 catches for 1,300 yards in 2019.
Yeah. But I mean, it's kind of crazy that he could have a year, like what is effectively a career year in 2019, and now we're 5-6 years later, and he was having another one in a kind of a different style, different offense, different quarterback. So he to me is just the guy that I feel like you are going to get exactly what you're paying for. Obviously, the injury ended his season, but I don't think that's like a, oh my God, he's coming off an ACL, I don't know what I'm going to get type of injury. I think he'll probably be fine. So
he's
to me,
done
I'm not
before too. He got hurt
Right.
in another contract year and was fine coming off of that. So he has shown that he can bounce back from this sort of stuff. And again, I don't think it's overly devastating.
No, not at all. And so he to me is like, I think any team that needs a receiver who's a little bit more physical and is going to give you something after the catch, I think he makes sense for teams like Houston. I think he makes a lot of sense for teams like the Rams. They might try to reshuffle their offensive line. I don't know what they're doing, but like if they want to go pay for a different receiver instead of Kupp, I think he makes a lot of sense. There are some other teams that he, I'll talk about one later, but I think he has some other destinations that he could go to. But he, to me, is going to be number one on the market for receivers for sure.
Now I feel bad because I think I'm going to spoil it because this is the first team that I had thought of where he might make sense and where he might land. The three teams I had said, two of them you already mentioned. I think he might make sense in Houston. They don't have a ton of money. They already restructured Nico earlier this week. We'll see if they do any of the other just cost cutting stuff. But for the most part, their chips are in. I mean, they pushed him in last year. They can make Shaq Mason a post-June 1st cut, but that doesn't give them a lot of cap relief right now. So they're kind of playing on their margins here in a way that they didn't have to a year ago. The Rams makes total sense. I mean, if you just want to drop somebody in that has a skill set that's kind of analogous to what Cooper Kupp gives you, but is a little bit younger, still a little bit more dynamic, Chris Godwin is exactly that. And then the one that I just would love to see, because I just think coming off of last year, coach that knows how to use him, you think about him connected with the other receivers that are in that offense and the other receiving options, him in Jacksonville with Trevor and Brian Thomas and Liam Cohen is something that I could get behind that. Because I do think even though he's a slot option, he's a very different slot option than what Christian Kirk is.
I love that. That is not the one I had in mind, so you
good,
have not spoiled
good,
it.
good.
I'll have one later, but that one I would love it in Jacksonville because again, there's proof of concept that he can do this very, very well at a high level in the Liam Cohen offense. I think he's a perfect fit to put next to Brian Thomas Jr. because they don't do any of the same things. Brian Thomas Jr. is a big vertical threat, explosive, all that stuff. Godwin can do all the dirty work. It's a perfect pairing to unlock really both of them.
The only thing, the Rams, it makes sense, but I wonder if the Rams want to go in a slightly different direction.
That's kind of where I'm at
receiver,
too.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, are they going to try to chase somebody who's more like a Matthew Golden in the draft that gives you a little bit more verticality to go with somebody like Puka? It's tempting to just do something that feels like a Kupp replacement, but maybe they want to go in a slightly different direction with their offense. The other two teams, to me, it's easy to picture how he fits there. I think some people are probably going to look at receiver needy teams that have a lot of cap space, like the Patriots, and they're going to try to put Chris Godwin there. Is that something that you'd like to see, or do you see Godwin more as a complementary piece in an offense that already has what feels like kind of a true number one receiver?
I would probably prefer that, and honestly, if I'm Godwin, even though if the Patriots could probably pay me a little bit more, I'm probably at the point where like I just want to play for somebody who I feel like can win sooner rather than later, which I don't know if the Patriots can. But yeah, I don't know if the Patriots, I love the fit so much. Obviously, I think he's such a good player that if they did it, I'd be like, ultimately, this is fine. But I just don't know if that's probably the best use of resources for them.
So let's just do this now because we probably should have done it at the top. This is on me. Earlier today, DK Metcalf comes out that he has requested a trade and that the Seahawks are going to allow him to explore said trade. So what do you think about DK Metcalf to a team like the Patriots? And if it's not New England, where do you think Metcalf makes the most sense?
So I actually do like the New England fit. And I know that he's, for as much as I love Drake May and some of the stuff that DK does, I know it's going to irritate me watching them. But they really, really need somebody on the outside, and they really need somebody who can stretch the field. DK obviously checks both of those boxes pretty comfortably. And they have all the money to spend on his contract. Like, that is obviously not an issue for them. So I think he makes probably the most sense there. We talked about it on the other show. Green Bay, I think, does make a lot of sense. You kind of sold me on that he can basically just be juiced up Christian Watson. So those to me are probably the two spots that make the most sense. I don't, Buffalo doesn't have the resources, but it would be cool. But that seems off the table.
So I think from a football perspective, it would make sense in Green Bay for what we talked about yesterday. You're just getting a souped up version of Christian Watson and one that's going to be on the field. Like if Christian Watson was always healthy, I think the Packers offense would feel different than it does. So just getting a healthier, better Christian Watson, that in theory, I think makes sense for Green Bay. But if you look at what the potential price tag would be, the idea of trading away like a second round pick and then having to give him an extension, I think that might be a little rich for the Packers, right? Like they're good enough where you're giving up so much to do that. I'm not sure that's worth it. Would you rather just take another chance with a receiver in the second round at that point? For the Patriots, you'll pay any price, right? Like you have to find
spend
one of these guys
$130 million.
somewhere. Yes. And so for them, it's like, all right, it's expensive if we have to give up the pick and an extension, but at a certain point, you have to do something with the resources that you have. So for them, I just think that there's a level of desperation and a level of need that pushes you to that place. For the Packers, I'm just not sure that rich of a price is worth it for what is a modest upgrade that gives you a little bit more certainty than somebody like Christian Watson does.
Can I interest you in Dallas Cowboys wide receiver DK Metcalf?
0% chance.
Okay. Well,
not that I don't like it, but
right,
0%
right.
chance that it happens. Like
they cleared a lot of money. I don't know, man.
There is no way that. Well, listen. All right, I'm talking myself into it now.
That was fast.
So the idea of trading for DK, and then even if they get the Micah Parsons thing handled, then the DK contract drama trickles all the way up to the regular season, and now Jerry can just be somebody who's like giving statements and talking all the time throughout the entire offseason because multiple guys need contracts. That may be appealing to them, but I think the idea of handing out 2 huge deals potentially in the same offseason after they just did it last year, that would surprise me. I do have a vertical receiver later on that I'm going to give to the Dallas Cowboys. So my mind is there.
Okay.
I just think DK might be a little bit rich. I think right now that just from a need and fit perspective, he makes the most sense for New England. The skill set, you could talk me into it with the Chargers, but again, I just feel like that's out of character. The idea of giving up a pick and giving him an extension, I just can't really see a team like the Chargers doing that. So if somebody is going to meet Seattle's price and meet DK's asking price, a team like the Patriots and a team in the situation like the Patriots, that makes the most sense to me. I don't know if anyone else is that desperate at this point.
I will say very quickly, I wish they weren't in the same division as the Rams because he would kind of make sense for the Rams to be like souped up what Sammy Watkins was for them 6 years ago or whatever, but there's no shot that's happening.
Let's keep running through these. Ronnie Stanley, probably next on this list here of the big ticket guys available in free agency on offense. Where would you like to see Ronnie Stanley go now that he has hit free agency? I mean, there was some talk last week about would they give him the tag? Would they have enough space to do that? So there is a very good chance that he hits the market here. Where would you like to see Ronnie Stanley end up if that happens?
I hope he doesn't move. I think the Ravens would be really dumb to not find a way to keep him in town.
I feel the same way.
Like he's one of the, like he had the exact because there was that 2-year stretch with Ronnie Stanley where it was like, man, he's getting banged up all the time. He doesn't feel like Ronnie Stanley, and this was the year where he came back to being like all pro level Ronnie Stanley, and it's like this is the thing that we wanted to pay for. So I would want to reward him. I would want to keep him around. There's not going to be any other option on the market that's going to be as good as Stanley, so I would keep him. However, if they do move on from him, I think a team maybe like oh man, I mean, obviously the Patriots, like that's kind of been my thing. It's just blank check Ronnie Stanley. Give him $60 million a year, dude. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Like you have so much money, just give him a blank check and figure it out.
Patriots make a lot of sense. I think the Chiefs, if they do end up wanting to upgrade the left tackle spot, and that's where they want to do it, they can restructure Mahomes and free up a ton of money this year. I mean, he has his base salary, and I believe he has some sort of roster bonus that if they wanted to convert that, they would be able to free up a ton of space if they had that sort of appetite this year. But I'm with you. I would like to see him land back in Baltimore just because I think it makes sense for where they are right now. If they restructured Lamar and did something like trading Mark Andrews, and they could get to like $40-ish million in cap space pretty easy, and there is no bigger need for where the Ravens are right now than left tackle if they let Ronnie Stanley go. So where is that money going to go if it's not to left tackle? So I would just like to see them retain Ronnie Stanley because I think it's the best use of those resources. The other guy I'd mentioned with Kansas City and just teams that need a left tackle in general, I'd sniff around Taylor Decker if I were one of these teams.
As a trade candidate?
Yeah.
Ooh.
He's getting a little older.
Mm-hmm.
This team has spent big on a lot of extensions recently. They traded up for that 4th-round developmental left tackle last year, Manu. I can't remember his first name. So they've got some guys potentially in the pipeline. It might be a little bit quick for that because I think he was really a developmental player when they traded for him. But that's a call I would make if I was a team that needed a left tackle here and I swung and missed on Ronnie Stanley just because it feels like there's going to be a moment where they might have to move on from Decker given the price tag and given his age with all the other things that they're having to spend money on here over the next couple of years. They would save $22 million against the cap next year if they traded for 2026 if they traded Taylor Decker now. So it's a phone call I would make if I were one of these teams. That's all I'll say.
I had not considered that at all, but if we're going to do what I talked about on the last show, where it's like, if you're the Lions, you kind of just got to do stuff that will keep the roster healthy and keep the window open. That's something that kind of clears up a lot of space for you, and you can kind of move into a new chapter before it's too late. So I haven't thought about it much, but I'm keeping tabs on it now.
Let's get to Sam Darnold. I feel like my thought on this is that Sam potentially lands somewhere between like the Baker contract and their Kirk contract as the cap goes up. I think that's probably the right price for somebody like him. on the market. What do you think that market looks like for Sam Darnold, and where do you think he potentially ends up?
So this I think is going to irritate a lot of people. I think the Vikings should just make an effort to keep him. And this isn't really about like, wow, Sam Darnold was incredible and they won 14 games or whatever last year and they can't give that up. To me, I just think there is a lot of uncertainty with JJ McCarthy just between the knee stuff. You haven't seen him play. He was a very young player. Like, it's just a lot of it is a little bit concerning to me. So I would want to have, if you can get Darnold for the Baker deal, yes, I would like to keep him around and kind of just continue it that way. If not that, we've talked about it before, Pete Carroll with a guy like Sam Darnold. He already did this with Geno Smith. I think that could make a whole lot of sense. So I would like those two.
I can't get behind the Darnold back to Minnesota thing. There's a lot of uncertainty around JJ McCarthy heading into next year. Guess who also had a lot of uncertainty surrounding him heading into last season? Sam Darnold.
Well, he was healthy.
Sam Darnold was. I'm not letting a meniscus tear get in the way of this plan here. This happened before last season. Like, I have to assume that JJ McCarthy is going to be healthy enough to have pretty much a full offseason here as the starting quarterback of the Vikings. You and I have talked about this going all the way back to like the playoffs and what that plan might look like. Even before that, when I was kind of just starting to talk myself into the idea of like, do the Vikings have to keep Sam Darnold? Like, is that where we're headed now? And I keep coming back to this point where they so intentionally moved onto a rookie quarterback timeline and moved off of a guy like Kirk Cousins so they could spend elsewhere. They knew they were going to have to spend on Justin Jefferson. They knew they were going to have to give Christian Darrisaw an extension. They've already paid Brian O'Neill. They've already paid TJ Hawkinson. They got to spend a little bit in free agency because they knew this was coming with guys like Grenard, Van Ginkel. They have to remake their entire secondary in free agency here. I do think the level of certainty with Darnold is nice. You've seen him be successful in this offense, but I think you have to make a bet on your coaching staff and your infrastructure here. And I think that whatever downgrades you get in 2025 from what Sam Darnold was to what JJ McCarthy is going to be, and I fully concede that may happen. He may not be as good as Sam Darnold was last year, but I think the gap between those two things is not worth $30 million. Like, I just don't think that gap is worth $30 million. I think that money is better spent shoring up the holes you still have on the interior of the offensive line and in the secondary.
It probably isn't worth $30 million, especially after the way that the final two games went. But there's just maybe I'm too hung up on the injury. I'm fully willing to concede that. Like, maybe it's not going to be as big of a deal as I think it is, but there's something
I just can't believe you're so bought in on Sam Darnold here.
I'm not. I really don't think that we think that differently about him. It's just I'm more concerned about like we've never seen JJ McCarthy play before and his knee just exploded. Like there's just a lot more. I think I'm more scared of the unknown.
This is the Tank Dell injury. This is a meniscus tear.
But we saw Tank, like, I don't know, man. We have not seen JJ McCarthy play football before. That is what scares me a little bit. I do trust the coaching staff. There's just like, I feel like because of the injury, the goalpost has moved a little bit just in terms of like, how willing are we to go into the unknown again?
Moving beyond Minnesota, you mentioned the Raiders. I think the two teams that I would keep an eye on here because I think they make sense for Sam Darnold because of where they're at right now are the Raiders and the Titans, right? If the Titans say, we would rather pay for a veteran quarterback at a mid-tier price, and then that frees us up to trade down from the number one overall pick to get a Travis Hunter or an Abdul Carter at 3 if we trade down with the Giants. I understand that as a path for the Vikings, where we just want a tad more certainty at quarterback, and if we're not paying top of the market money, if we can get him for an uptick on the Baker price, we think that's our best path forward. I think that makes sense for them, and if you're the Raiders, this is an option for you at quarterback. It's a multi-year option for you at quarterback that prevents you from having to overdraft one at 7 if that's your preferred route.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot. It does make a lot more sense for those teams, especially like the Titans would be really funny though because it's the same kind of quarterback. You're just hoping he's 120% version of it. Like Will Levis and Darnold. If you just listed the traits, it's kind of the same stuff. It's just Darnold had proof of concept that it could be decent.
I think Darnold moves a little bit better in the pocket, and I think Darnold's brain short circuits less often than Will Levis's brain short circuits in the pocket.
Currently.
Yes, currently.
5 years ago, Sam Darnold? No, but that's my point. Yeah.
Currently, it does. And unfortunately for the Titans, they're not in a position where they can see out the next 5 years of the Will Levis experiment. They can't take the time to get from 2018 Sam Darnold to 2024 Sam Darnold with Will Levis. Maybe that happens for some other team. That unfortunately cannot happen for the Tennessee Titans. Everyone there will be fired twice before we arrive at that moment. So they need a more immediate answer there.
Yeah, I mean, it took, 4 teams for Darnold to finally get here? So maybe in 2029 when Levis is jumped around a little bit, we'll be okay.
Maybe he's the 2029 Titans quarterback, but I don't think he's going to be the 2025 starting Titans quarterback. Let's keep rolling through these here. Beller, you and I have to have a conversation on big ticket items in terms of the guys that you're including on this list. I'm not talking about Cam Robinson in these terms. I refuse to do it. Drew Dahlman is the next one I'm getting to here. Where do we think Drew Dahlman's market settles, and where do you think Drew Dahlman makes the most sense as pretty clear-cut the top center on the board?
We kind of talked about this on the other show. Like, Dahlman is an above-average center. I do think he benefits from being pretty clearly the best one on the market, but he's really only going to fit, I think, for teams that want to do some more zone stuff or just going to be lighter and be more spread teams. Like, the Chargers could use a center. I don't think he makes any sense for the stuff that they want to do.
I also don't know if the Chargers need a center, by the way.
Really?
I think there's a chance they move Zion Johnson to center and they actually spend at guard this offseason.
Oh.
We'll talk about that in a second.
We will talk about that in a second because I do find that actually really interesting.
I have a fit for the Chargers that I wanted to throw. We're doing best fits here in a minute. I wanted to throw somebody on the Chargers that I actually think makes a lot of sense for them.
I don't know. Like if the Packers let Josh Myers walk, do they want to go try the Drew Dahlman thing? I don't remember what San Francisco is paying Brendel, but like Dahlman is just a better version of that style of player. Are they willing to go spend for that? Because their offensive line, I think, was not as good last year as they were hoping. So just some more of those zone teams, I think, kind of make the most sense for him.
Now that they have Tooney and Jonah Jackson, I'm actually sort of intrigued by the idea of adding Dahlman if I'm the Bears. I think that could potentially make sense. God, you spending a shitload on your offensive line if you end up doing that. But you do have 2 rookies on 2 rookie contracts at tackle. So if you just think about how the spending is spread around and the fact that you still have $50-ish million in cap space, if you can keep that first-year cap hit low for Dahlman, I can talk myself into that. Then you've remade your entire interior of the offensive line in a single offseason. That's one team. Here's another one that I'm going to throw out that I actually think makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought about it until this morning. Why not Seattle?
So I guess now, especially if they move DK and now that Lockett's gone, they do have the money for it. 2 days ago, they did not have the money for it, in my opinion, but it is clear now. I don't know for them if, like, I would much rather spend at guard and just play Olu again. Like, I don't know if...
I completely understand that. I was going to say, in my notes, it's like, Oluwatimi was okay down the back half of last year. So you may not need to improve there. You may think the guard is probably more of a priority, but just throwing out teams that would make sense in terms of schemes that would make sense, he would fit them if they wanted to move in a different direction.
Yeah, because again, zone stuff, they hired Clint Kubiak, so he does make a lot of sense for them. Yeah, to me, it was just, I was actually, I did Michael Sean's show, Seahawks podcast, and I was like, I just don't know if what you're going to spend for Dahlman is worth, like, the value you're going to get over Olu. And again, Olu is, like, a fine starter at best, but to me, that one I had a little bit of some questions with.
A couple of these other guys in here, I actually had fits for them in terms of where I wanted to send them, so I'm going to save that. 2 more that I want to hit that are probably going to get paid on multi-year deals because, again, they're second contract players and they're young, which is a rarity among this group. Will Fries, former Colts right guard, Will Fries. I like me some Will Fries, man. I think he is a good player. The Bears don't need guards anymore, but he is somebody I had circled if they did not sign Trey Smith. Where would you like to see Will Fries wind up at the end of all this?
The team we just talked about, I think, would be, Seattle if they were willing to spend. I know John Schneider famously doesn't seem to care about guards, but I do think he would make a lot of sense for them. Cincinnati, I don't know where they're going to find, if that's what they want to spend on, because they need to spend basically all of their cap space on defense probably, but I think he actually makes a lot of sense for them. And then obviously a team like the Chargers, I think would make a ton of sense. Like if they are a team that they are committed to making sure the interior is going to be what they want it to be, I think sticking him at right guard makes a ton of sense for them.
I'll throw out 2 more. 2 teams that know Will Fries pretty well because they've seen him 2-ish times a year over the last 3 years. Tennessee, desperately needs a right guard and has money to spend. And Jacksonville. Jacksonville needs to remake the interior of their offensive line potentially. If Brandon Scherf is moving on, they've got a bit of money to spend. So I think he potentially makes sense there. Let's stick in this same general area with the guards. Tevin Jenkins, former Bears guard Tevin Jenkins, also hitting free agency. Any landing spots for Tevin Jenkins that make sense to you?
I mean, a lot of the same ones. I actually kind of would like him specifically for Jacksonville, because if you think about so much of what Liam Cohen did well with the Bucs, is it was a lot of gap stuff, and like Jenkins actually can move people when he's
a big boy.
He's a big boy. He was initially a tackle. Like, he's just a big man. He was initially a right tackle, so he's a big guy. He can move people. The problem with Jenkins is just it's a little bit of the Jonah Jackson thing. He's going to play like 9 games a year, and at least to this point, that has been true. Maybe you get lucky, and that's not true the next 2 years. Maybe he plays 15, 16. But that to me is the sticking point. And so for a team like Jacksonville, where you're trying to rebuild this thing and you're trying to just see what's out there, I think it would make a lot of sense. If you're a team that's like closer to competing and you want a little bit more certainty, I don't know if he makes sense for a team like that.
The team I'll throw out, because again, I think he makes sense for their timeline and what they need. What about Arizona?
Yeah,
you just drop him in at left guard for the Cardinals.
Yes, where they're a tier below like serious competing, but they're in that range of like, we could take a swing on a guy that has only played 9 games a year to this point, but maybe he plays 16 for us and it's going to work out. And just like in terms of ethos and the way that he plays, he's perfect for all the stuff that they do schematically. So I love that fit.
I think if you're looking at the way that they're looking at their interior, right, Froholt is really good for what they are at center. I think they're probably keeping a candle lit for Isaiah Adams, and if ideally he could win that job at right guard at some point. They drafted him in the 3rd round this year, but I think they want to get a little bit more urgent than they were last offseason, where it was like, we're going to sign Evan Brown and just kind of see how it goes. The idea of maybe being a little bit more aggressive and trying to find a real answer there to upgrade that spot, while also just admitting where you are in your timeline, right? Like Kevin Zeitler may not make sense for the Cardinals, but a guy like Tevin Jenkins might. And so that's the type of swing that I think aligns with where this team is right now.
That's perfect, yeah.
All right, let's get to some of these. I'm gonna let you do 2, and then I'll do 2. And then we'll just kind of roll through them. Your favorite 2 fits that you had at the top of your list.
So I'm going to skip some of the ones we already talked about. We already mentioned Chris Godwin in Jacksonville. I already mentioned I think Darnold should stay a Viking. But the big one to me, it's actually not a big one, but one I would just love to see, Juwan Johnson should be a Denver Bronco.
Don't apologize for this one. Do not apologize for this, because I almost did the same thing.
It just makes too much sense, right? Like, they need a tight end more than almost any other team in the league. Juwan Johnson is a huge guy, great red zone threat, and he's already worked with Sean Payton before. Like, just every part of it makes so much sense. And he's not a guy that you would be committing to him being like, he has to be our tight end 1. We can't spend any other resources. We're committed here. No, you can spend a okay chunk of change on him, and you can go draft another guy in the 2nd round, and you can give yourself so many more new options at tight end that they just didn't have last year. So I love that. And then we actually didn't, we didn't. I should have brought it up in the last thing, but with Drew Dahlman, I think the Vikings would actually make a lot of sense if KOC wants to remain a zone guy. They do still have Garrett Bradbury for 1 more year, but it's $2 million to cut him. I don't think that means anything if you're trying to upgrade at center. So I think that one would make a lot of sense if they want to get serious there.
I like that. That's creative, because I do think that it was worth thinking about how that team goes from point A to point B. How do you get the right sort of improvements? That makes sense. Just saying we're going to roll with Garrett Bradbury because he's been here. Being a little bit more creative than that. I actually like where your head is at with that one. I've got a few here to run through. I love Kevin Zeitler going to the Bengals, right? This is a team that with the right moves can be competitive this year. It's low cost. This is a team that doesn't spend contract-wise in the same way that other teams do in free agency with structure, right? So if you're going to be competing for a guy like Will Fries and he's getting guarantees into the 2nd year that you're not willing to give him, are you going to have to be a little bit more creative with the guys that you're chasing? He has been in Cincinnati. Whether or not that's a good or bad thing, I don't know. I'm not sure how acrimonious the end was there, but I do think their needs, timeline, and resources fit for a player like that.
So with him having been in Cincinnati before, is he the last good interior offensive lineman to play for the Cincinnati Bengals? He left in 2016
okay before he got hurt.
Kappa was okay, but Pro Bowl caliber, or not even below that. Zeitler's probably the last firmly good interior guy they've had. So yeah, get a homecoming, bring him back.
I have fond memories of the Clint Bowling, Kevin Zeitler days for the Cincinnati Bengals, and they feel very far away now. So Zeitler back to Cincinnati was just one, again, it's very modest, but it's one that I was like, I like that actually. I think that makes sense for where they are. And then the one that we alluded to earlier, I love Darius Slayton going to Dallas.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, it solves the same thing.
If we're going to add some vertical juice to the Cowboys offense, Darius Slayton coming over on like the Darnell Mooney deal, this year's version of the Darnell Mooney deal, where you're saying you're in a complete shit show for your entire career up to this point. We're going to bring you to a place with a real quarterback, a real number one receiver. You are going to be slotted in as our vertical number two outside the numbers option with the guy as our number one who plays a little bit in the slot. We move him all around. I just think that is the type of skill set that has been missing in this offense. The idea that when I was watching this team last year, I was begging for more Kevontae Turpin because of how little explosion that they had.
I remember that.
To me, was I wrong? Is that
No.
unfounded? Like you see a guy, it's like you're walking through the desert and you just see like a pool of muddy water. Like that's what Kevontae Turpin was when I was watching the Cowboys last year.
I didn't blame you. You brought that up in like week 8 or 9 or something, and I was like, at first glance, or when you first said it, I just revolted. I was like, there's no way. And then I thought about it, and I was like, man, I don't know what else they would do.
And I think Darius Slayton solves a little bit of that. Even though Jerry came out today and said we don't need to fill any holes in free agency. Is something he said today when talking to the media. So there's a chance. The other great thing that he said, so they've restructured Dak and CD already. They've freed up like $50 million in cap space. So I assume they'll do something. But yet, and then on top of that, he said, well, the fact people were asking him, by not signing Micah, does that affect your ability to be active in free agency? And he said, well, it didn't affect us last year when we didn't sign CD or Dak. You sat out free agency last year. What are you talking about? You signed Eric Kendricks. So if that's going to be your free agency strategy this year, then I'm a little bit concerned if I'm a Cowboys fan.
I am very concerned, man. And what's funny is like Darius Slayton almost does feel too expensive for them the way that they've operated, which is ridiculous because he's not going to cost you that much money. He's going to earn like the 7th highest receiver contract this offseason, but for the Cowboys, that might be too much. Quickly before we get away from Slayton, I actually also had him down, but for the Chargers. Because it feels like,
makes sense.
Because that's not them spending too much on receiver, but it's like, man, we need somebody outside so that we can keep McConkey inside. And like you said, he's a vertical guy, which is, hey man, Justin Herbert can throw the ball very far. Let's get a guy.
I don't mind that at all. I think that makes sense. I think we're in the same place. I think Slayton makes sense for more teams than I probably thought coming into this exercise. Whereas I look at the depth charts around the league and I think about all the older receivers who are going to be available in free agency, going a little bit younger and getting that vertical speed with the guy like Slayton, it's appealing for me with some of these teams that we're talking about. All right, a couple more. And you have any other fits that you liked, wanted to talk about?
Those were kind of the main ones that I had. I'm not super excited about Amari Cooper necessarily, but I think just in terms of fit, he kind of makes sense for what the Chargers or the Broncos need. Chargers could just use anyone who could play on the outside. Broncos, they already have a number one, which I think is helpful. But we've also seen Cooper be best when he can be more of a slot Z than like a true X, which I think in Denver he obviously would be. So that could make sense for them at the right price.
I kind of like Amari Cooper on the Cardinals. Just giving them
for the same reason, yeah.
Yes, giving them like a real number 2 option. I think Michael Wilson probably is best slotted as a 3. The question is whether or not Amari Cooper aligns with the timeline that we talked about with Arizona. Is he a little bit too old to make sense for where the Cardinals are right now? But just some other legitimate receiving option dropped into that offense to go along with Marvin Harrison and Trey McBride and maybe slot Michael Wilson more into his natural spot as your number 3, maybe number 4 receiver. I think that they should be in that mindset. Whether it's Amari Cooper, I don't know, but that's one I was going to throw out. A couple offensive line ones that I had. I don't even know if I want this. I think somebody is going to talk themselves into the Jed Wills reclamation project, right? He's been banged up. He played left tackle for the Browns. He played right tackle in college. He has a big time pedigree. Does somebody take a swing on him? The team I was thinking about, and they would play him at left tackle, but I think the Steelers are going to want to add some sort of competition for Broderick Jones at left tackle because Fontenot is going to come back and play on the right side is my assumption. So somebody to push him that would be a low cost option with some upside. Somebody like Wills, I think, would be interesting there. Two other offensive line ones. I had Patrick McCarry going to the Titans. If they miss out on a guy like Fries, this is you're laughing at me because it's just the least ambitious choice of all time. But he's a guy who's played a bunch of positions. And so in theory, if you're trying to remake your offensive line, you sign Patrick McCarry to a deal for $8 million a year, and he could play right guard or right tackle for you, depending on how the rest of free agency and the draft shakes out. I actually think that makes sense for where the Titans are right now. You're laughing at me.
I am, because it's like you said, Patrick, like the idea that Patrick McCarry could fix something for anybody to me is very funny. But then you look at the Titans depth chart, especially the right side, and you're like, man, Patrick McCarry could fix something for this team.
Depending, let's say you land a guard that you like. Maybe you could play him at right tackle. Let's say you land a tackle you like. You could play him at right guard. So just a piece of an offensive line that is rebuilding. That's intriguing to me. And the one that I alluded to earlier, I actually do like this one a lot. Mekhi Becton to the Chargers. So if they
Greg
move
Roman
Zion Johnson to center and you get a big-bodied guard like that to push people around in a way that you couldn't this year, if they cut Trey Pipkins, even if they don't, they still probably need a starting guard if they do move Zion Johnson to center. So Becton as like a little bit of kick-ass for a team that needs it on the interior, that one actually does make a lot of sense to me.
That is probably... If Greg Roman had to rank every free agent in the class, Mekhi Becton's probably like top 5 right now.
I like that one. You were making fun of the McCarry one, but you like the Becton one.
The Becton one I'm in on, yes.
One other category we wanted to do here, we can run through these pretty quickly, but I want to talk about like some consolation prizes. Like if you miss out on a guy that's at the top of this list, what are the other guys you could potentially pivot to and still land in a decent spot? You had a few of these, so why don't you run through your consolation prize options for me on offense here?
Yeah, so Chris Godwin, like we said, bell of the ball as far as receivers go. If you miss on him, Josh Palmer gives you some of the stuff you like from Godwin, where just tough guy, he can play a little bit of inside and outside, really reliable catching the football. So he's not nearly as sexy or as explosive as Godwin, but it's something. I think if you miss out on either Darnold or Fields, we talked about this on the last show in terms of like quarterbacks that have a chance to reclaim themselves. I would not be that opposed to a team bringing in Mac Jones as like competition for somebody. So like that could make sense to me. And then your guy, Will Fries.
The Colts, for example.
Yes, the Colts. That's perfect. The Colts would make a ton of, especially because he's so stylistically different, right? And speaking of the Colts, your guy, Will Fries, if a team misses out on him, I think taking a swing on Robert Jones actually from the Dolphins, he took over his first year as a starter last year. He's a 320-pound guy. He can kind of move people. That's just not what the Dolphins do, so I don't know if that was the best fit for him. I could see him actually being a better fit for somebody else somewhere else.
I didn't have a ton here. The guy I wanted to mention here, because we hadn't talked about anywhere else, is Dan Moore. Just because I do think that Dan Moore is like a starting caliber left tackle, and those guys just aren't really available most years. So we're talking about Ronnie Stanley. Let's say hypothetically he ends up going back to Baltimore. Then you have guys like Cam Robinson, like Dan Moore, that are at least capable starters for you if you have a hole at that spot. So like the Patriots, if you didn't end up getting a Ronnie Stanley, could you give Dan Moore $14 million a year and at least have a capable starting left tackle? I think that by the end of this season, he had arrived there. It was definitely a ride for him in Pittsburgh over the last few years, but that's somebody I would throw out. And I do think that if you need a stopgap option, right? If you're the Chiefs and you miss out on a Ronnie Stanley, you can't get something like the Decker trade done. Do you just try to sign Tyron Smith for 1 year to get yourself through the 2025 season before you can find a long-term answer at that spot? So I just think there are more capable options at left tackle this year than we typically see. The irony is there aren't that many teams that really desperately need a starting left tackle right now. It's kind of like quarterback, where a lot of teams could probably use an upgrade in the right circumstances, but I think plenty of teams have players that they can at least trot out in week 1 and feel okay about it, which was a little bit surprising to me. But when you go through the depth charts, that's kind of the place where I landed with it.
I think it's especially trickier with left tackle too, because it's such a good offensive line class. Like, are we just going to get to a point where teams just look at these middling left tackles and are like, I don't know if I want to sign that. I'd rather just see if we can get to the draft and land one of the top 4 or 5 tackles, whatever it is, and maybe the market depresses for some of those guys.
Well, my other thought here would be you could do both, right?
Right. Yeah,
Like
that too.
I think that if you sign one of these mid-tier, Dan Moore types or Cam Robinson or whoever it ends up being, and you still want to take Armand Membu at 4, if you're the Patriots, like that is still an option for you. The Patriots may be a bad example because they need 2 starting tackles, but if you're a team that only needs 1, you can probably double up here and just have a stopgap for a year while developing the guy you want to be your left tackle of the future. Because while these guys are playable, they have ceilings, right? Like there's a reason that these guys are available in free agency at a position that we typically don't see a lot of available free agents. There's been a lot of stuff we'd like to see on the show so far, things that we're excited about or things that we think could make sense. I wanted to talk about a couple guys that you think could be landmines in this process for teams, guys that might seem appealing, but as we dig down into it, there might be a little bit more risk than teams are willing to admit. So who are those players for you in this process?
I've got a few, all at different positions. As far as the receivers go, I think some of the receivers, it's very obvious already that they might be like a tricky one, like Amari Cooper. I think we already know that that's a risky proposition. I think Stephon Diggs, to me, probably still has more of the shine than is warranted. And so that, to me, is one that I'm a little bit scared of. And I think for
what
a lot
makes you
of
say
teams,
this?
he's getting older, some of the injury history stuff. I also just don't love him stylistically. And maybe this is part of the issue with Houston is I think Houston misunderstood what their receiving room needed to be like. I think they didn't realize they needed bigger, more rugged players, and they go and sign the flashy thing in Diggs, and it just makes no sense. So maybe I'm just a little bit burned by that and not wanting another team to make the same mistake. I do think in the right spot, Diggs could make sense, but he just seems a little bit siren song-y to me, is kind of the thing, at least as far as this receiver class goes. Moving to a different position, like Cam Robinson at tackle, I just think if you miss on Ronnie Stanley, it feels like Cam Robinson is probably going to be next up. I just don't know if he's a whole lot better than any of the other guys that you can sign in this left tackle class. So if he's going to be the guy who gets the most money, that would scare me a little bit. And then the other one to me is Najee Harris. And this is not like a don't pay running backs. It's, all that other stuff. I just think people are going to maybe overreact to, last year we paid Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley and it worked out. It's like, we've seen Derrick Henry run for 2,000 yards and Saquon is one of the most talented players we've ever seen. Najee Harris is like, fine. So I just don't know if someone should convince themselves that he can be like super good.
The only one that I had, and this is funny because I do think he does make sense for the Chargers, I think Mekhi Becton is a little bit of this. If you're looking at what he did in Philadelphia with Jeff Stoutland, with Lane Johnson next to him, and you're thinking, all right, wheels up, here we go, I think that could potentially be a little bit misleading. In the right situation, I do think his skill set could be useful, but I also think I'm always weary of signing the guy after his reclamation year. Right? Because sometimes that is dependent on situation. It's dependent on, he looked good for a few $1,000,000. Does he look good for $12 million a year? I think that can be a little bit dangerous for teams. And I think that, again, I'm intrigued by him in certain situations, but I think you have to understand what you're getting if you are signing him to a multi-year deal.
And that's a perfect way to frame it. These are not necessarily landmines for every team. It's just easy to see a team where he doesn't make sense for them, convincing themselves that that is the right team to sign with, and they just make a mistake.
I want to run some guys who you think could be like this year's Zach Bond. Just some hidden gems on offense in this year's free agent class that you think in the right situation for the right price could outperform whatever they're going to make.
They're hard to find, man. I'll tell you that, because this is it's a hard thing to find. I'll try to rattle a couple though.
Yeah,
Elijah Moore.
By definition, it's hard to find.
Yes, by definition,
getting more money in free agency.
Exactly, they'd be the guy who's getting $15 million a year. Elijah Moore was productive early in his career, had a little bit of inside-outside versatility. I think the tail end of his career with the Jets was just weird in terms of the quarterback and offensive situation. And then his entire time in Cleveland has been weird with some of the quarterback and offensive situations. So I think and he's still young. I think he's only like 25, 26. So there's a chance that he could just totally revive himself. Another two I had were both running backs. Ty Johnson, probably never going to step in and be like a 200 touch guy, but for someone who could just be like a super, super valuable passing down player for somebody next year, he already was for the Bills. I think that could make sense. If a team wants a guy who can maybe eat like 150 carries randomly, Emmanuel Wilson from the Packers. Now, I don't think
Emmanuel Wilson, man.
He's good. He runs hard as hell, dude. And like he was really productive last year, runs hard. His vision is decent enough. I think he is not an unrestricted free agent, so Packers are going to have first bid on this. But if they allow him if they allow him out of the building, like he could make sense for a cheap deal for someone, and they could just stumble into a starting running back.
God, I love that we're getting Emmanuel Wilson and Ty Johnson talk on our day one of our free agency previews. I'll throw out two guys. One, I still kind of like De'Ami Brown. I like De'Ami Brown coming out of North Carolina. I thought he had some interesting flashes at the end of last year. He does more with the ball in his hands than you think, because coming into the NFL, thought of him more as like a vertical piece because just the way that North Carolina offense was structured. But when they threw him a lot of screens, especially early last year in Washington, and I actually think he was better with the ball in his hands than I anticipated. So like a team like Houston, right? If you need another receiver and you want somebody who has a little bit of verticality, but also you can just spit the ball out to, and you don't want to spend a lot for it, I think that he's at least a useful piece. And then the other guy I would throw out is coming off an Achilles, so there's obviously a ton of risk here. But James Daniels was playing really, really good football for the Steelers before he got hurt last year. So if you can get him on a one-year deal and you feel like he's healthy, maybe that's something that could hit for you. So those are the two guys I would throw out in this class.
I like both of those. James Daniels, like you said, he has been really good in the past, and it could just be like we give him the 1 year prove it deal off an injury. Maybe he's great again. So I think that would be a really good bet. De'Ami Brown is like, I almost had him here, but then as I was doing the exercise, I was like, it would be ridiculous if Washington let him go, right? Like, he's probably not going to cost you that much. Just keep him around. They have, like, no other receivers on the roster, so they probably should.
They traded for Debo, right? And so
right,
maybe there's a chance where it's like, we already have these two guys. We feel like it's a little bit of an overlap in terms of what we'd ask him to do. I think De'Ami Brown, the other guy I would throw out is Josh Palmer. Like, and you mentioned him as the consolation prizes. I think those are two guys that are going to be appealing for teams that just need a starting caliber receiver. Like if you're the Titans and you just think, all right, we need somebody that we could just drop opposite of Calvin Ridley, a guy like Josh Palmer does potentially make sense for you. I think even though they're underwhelming from a fantasy perspective and they're never going to be big name guys, I think both of them are capable starting receivers that you could potentially get at a discount. And they're significantly younger than a bunch of the other guys who are going to be available in this group specifically. Let's round this out here with the potentially realistic veteran trades that we would like to see over the next couple of weeks. I have several of these. I'm going to let you kick us off. What is the first veteran trade that you would be interested in seeing?
I think Mark Andrews should be an Indianapolis Colt. And I think this makes a lot of sense for both of the teams. One, the Ravens would save about $11 million if Mark Andrews was not on the team next year, which would go a long way for making sure that they could keep Ronnie Stanley. They also have Isaiah Likely already, so it's not like they would not have another starting tight end. Like they would have another guy. So I think from their
Charlie
perspective,
Kohler too. Like they have multiple tight ends on the roster. Like they could live without Mark Andrews, even though Mark Andrews is still a good player.
Exactly. Like he still has use, which is why I want him to go to an offense that could use a little bit more juice from the tight end position. The Colts are losing two of their top three tight ends in free agency this offseason. Not that it was a great tight end room to begin with, but like they need to replenish it. Andrews just makes so much sense in terms of being a guy who gives them a little bit more over the middle of the field, a little bit of juice. And truthfully, there is some overlap in terms of the skill sets between what Andrews is and what Dallas Goedert was at times for Shane Steichen in Philly. And so from that perspective, it just made a lot of sense to me.
I also tried to send Mark Andrews somewhere, but it was to the Broncos. Similar to the conversation we were having about Juwan Johnson, Mark Andrews going to the Broncos, I actually do like that one. I think it's a decent price, and I think that the Broncos getting for $7 million. The Ravens save $11 million if they trade him. So Mark Andrews to the Broncos is one of the first ones I thought of.
I think that would be interesting too, because this is going to sound dumb, but like the difference between the Broncos signing Juwan Johnson's versus maybe trading for Mark Andrews is like, how close do we really think we are? If you trade for Mark Andrews, you think that you can actually like go and do it this year. Whereas Juwan Johnson, it's like, okay, we're good, but we're going to try to build this thing a little bit slower and take this step by step.
What's your next one?
My next one is, so there have been a million trade things between Packers receivers, whether it's bringing them in, taking them out, whatever it is. To me, I would actually, if I had to trade a guy from that room, I would probably trade Dontavian Wicks. And I think that there are a lot of teams who would be willing to make that type of dice roll. I think the Bills, it would make a lot of sense. They could maybe use a guy who could beat man coverage. It's what they tried to do with Amari Cooper last year. It's
I
what they tried to do
absolutely
with
love
Cooper last year.
Dontavian Wicks to the Bills. If you think about it, with Coleman being like your big-bodied outside the numbers guy, Shakir is your slot guy, on Dontavian Wicks can be your slasher type. I actually really like that a lot. And if he's the odd man out, especially if they make a move for another receiver.
That's the other
talking
thing.
about. Yeah.
Right. If Green Bay wants to make a different move, change it up a little bit, to me, Wicks might just be the odd man out, especially because he's been so inconsistent. So I think that would make a lot of sense for them. And then two other teams I think it could make sense for. The Raiders need some sort of talent and explosion at wide receiver. So I think if Pete Carroll maybe wants to take the dice roll on that, I think it could make sense. And then even if the Seahawks don't move on from DK, they just cut Tyler Lockett. The Seahawks, I think, would make a lot of sense if they wanted to make a move for a guy like Dontavian Wicks.
I like those. The Buffalo one is my favorite, though, just because I think with what they already have, it does make a lot of sense. I had a few more here. I'm trying to send Wyatt Teller somewhere. The Browns are in this weird purgatory where I don't really know what they are. He's entering the final year of his deal next year. It probably would have to be after June 1st to financially make sense for the Browns. So this is something you'd have to do a little bit later into the summer. But a team like the Jags that's trying to remake their interior, if you want to get a little bit more physical, he's still only 31. So I think somebody's sniffing around him, not now, but maybe later in the summer for a Browns team that is in this weird limbo and trying to save money. That's a call I would make if I were one of these teams. Kyle Pitts to the Chargers.
My ears are perking up. I'm kind of in.
Because I think that because they have Disley, and they just need a receiving-only option at tight end. And if you can't find juice elsewhere at receiver, and you just think, we need to add somebody that can be like a capable, explosive pass catcher. It's a lot. He's making $10 million against the cap this year on his fifth-year option. And it's been disappointing to this point, like to say the least. But just something from a receiving talent standpoint dropped into that offense because they already have Disley. I think that you can use him in the way that he's probably best used.
And I think this makes a lot of sense for two reasons. One, the issue with Pitts is not talent. Like it is very, I think to me, it's been some of the injury stuff. And I think it's also just so many of the coaching changes that have happened around him, so many different offenses. It's like, can we just get him with a guy like Jim Harbaugh, who I think almost always gets the best out of any player? I think it would make a ton of sense for him there. I also think people just think Kyle Pitts is like way worse than he actually is. I think we're just so burned by the rookie season was incredible. They spent a top 5 pick on him.
And it's the fantasy stuff.
It's the fantasy stuff. But like in reality, he's a solid, if inconsistent at times, but tight end who can give you some really explosive plays. Like for a team like the Chargers, I think this makes all the sense in the world.
I love like him and Disley as your tight end room. And then if you can add
Couldn't
one
be more
more
different.
receiver with Ladd McConkey, I think that that's a good diversification of your skill sets. Where do you want to see Cooper Kupp?
Oh man. I mean, if Jacksonville is going to miss out on Chris Godwin, like I think it would actually make a lot of sense for them there to like get a veteran in that offense and like go, kind of figure that out.
I don't mind that at all. And I do think he does make sense for the Steelers. Just in terms of like the skill set that they need within the offense. No, they sniffed around him, but they need somebody else. So Pittsburgh is where I wanted to send him. All right, I just did a defense one that I was overly excited about. I'm going to use that as a segue to set up the show that we're doing tomorrow. We're doing a defense show tomorrow. So the defense one that I just accidentally threw out that we edited out, that will be on tomorrow's show. Just know that I'm so excited about that one and some of the defense picks that we had that I'm trying to do them a day early. So we are going to save the defense takes for tomorrow. For today, that is all we've got with the offensive free agents. Let's get to our conversation with Joe Buscaglia as part of our On the Cusp series that we're doing with all of these teams that are right there just trying to figure out what they can do this offseason to get them over the top. We already did the Ravens. We already did the Packers. Today is the Bills with our Bills writer, Joe Buscaglia. Let's get to that conversation right now. Joining us now, it is our Bills writer here at The Athletic, Joe Buscaglia. Joe, how you doing?
I'm great. I'm now fully rested from another deep playoff run. Well, deep-ish. But yeah.
It was pretty deep. Yeah.
I mean, it's only the second time they made it to the AFC Championship game. And it really felt like they were actually going to do it this year. And for them to fall short again was just absolutely wild. So
I think they're starting to crawl out of that hole too.
Yeah.
I saw Brandon Beane yesterday, and I was chatting with people with the Super Bowl who know Josh Allen a little bit, and they were just talking about how hard he took this one and how it just felt a little bit different than everything else. And part of me is like, getting this close and falling short over and over and over again, at a certain point, it has to weigh on you. But at the same time, you're that close.
Mhm.
And I think that's at the core of this conversation. And what I want to talk about here is how you finally close that gap. Like, what needs to happen for it to be a conversation about how they did it, not why they got close again. So let's do that.
Yeah.
As you're sitting here and you're thinking about this Bills offseason and you're stacking up the priorities of how they can get from point A to point B, what are the first couple things on that list for you?
Well, I think the one thing to point out before even getting to that, that is important to know about this offseason is how vastly different it is than what they went through last year.
Yes.
Because they had to cut a bunch of people. They did all of it with having some flexibility in 2025 and beyond in mind. Like, there is a reason that they traded Stephon Diggs and took all 31 million of his dead cap onto their ledger last year, so that way they could have the flexibility to do what they wanted this year. Now they don't have an impactful free agent outside of maybe Rasul Douglas. I suppose you could throw Amari Cooper in there, but he really didn't do much for them even after the trade.
What do you make of that, by the way? I was talking about with a coach yesterday about this. I'm curious, like, what your view on this is before we get a little bit deeper into everything else.
Yeah, so Amari Cooper to me looked great on paper, and then he suffered a wrist injury which set him back. But also before that, he wasn't getting out on the field a ton, and the fact that he was effectively their fourth wide receiver down the stretch and not getting legitimate snaps. I mean, if he's out there and playing, you put him out there more than 40% of snaps, but they just didn't. And he wasn't separating nearly as well as he did on film from Cleveland even earlier in that season. And to me, that was one of their biggest issues. So that's why when I'm looking at this free agent list and I'm thinking about impactfulness, he doesn't really pop up on that, because I just don't know that how much you would have to pay him is worth the squeeze with what you would get when you already have Keon Coleman and probably Matt Collins coming back on a 1-year deal, if I had to guess.
So they don't have the amount of free agents they did last year. There aren't
Right.
as many tough financial decisions, but this
Right.
team is still up against it. Like, if you look at the cap situation right now, they're $10 million over the cap.
Yes.
They're going to move on from Von Miller. So that's
I don't know.
interesting.
I don't
Okay, let's talk about that then.
So that's the easy one, because you look at the cap sheet and you're like, okay, they could save 8.4 right now to lop him off. But that would also leave him with a 15.4 dead charge. And they also liked Von. Von took a pay cut last year when he had guaranteed money, which is an important factor in this.
Okay.
He wants to go ring chasing. He doesn't have any guaranteed money right now. So if Brandon Beane goes to Von and says, look, we want you here, we can't pay you what you're on there for. Come down $10 million. Guarantees you $7 million, which is probably more than he would get on the open market right now. And come chase a ring with us. And $7 million guaranteed, and takes him down $10 million on the cap sheet. That's a win-win. So that's why, to me, I think I wouldn't write off Von Miller being in Buffalo next year.
I like this. Okay, but even with that solution, you're still at 0 now.
Yes.
And you want some flexibility because you do need to add talent to this
Yep.
roster. Do you just assume that they restructure everybody again, whether it's Josh,
Yep.
Ed Oliver, Deion Dawkins, that you just think that's probably going to happen?
Those three moves exactly. Josh Allen will get you 11. Ed Oliver will get you 8.3, and Deion will get you a little over 10. That gets you to 30. And then you have some other ones that you can dip into. I mean, you can move on from Sam Martin if you want to for $2 million. You can move on from AJ.
We
for
don't need to do
3.
every single
Yeah,
one.
no,
but yes.
I got you.
For this team specifically, though, finding that money in the couch cushions is important.
Yes.
So maybe we should talk about Sam Martin for
Yeah,
$2 million.
but they also have a bunch of other restructures that they can dip into, but they would probably like to not do that with, like Dawson Knox is a perfect one for that.
Milano probably.
Milano,
Yeah.
you cannot touch Milano's
Yeah.
contract this year. You just see what he is and then assess it in 2026. But yeah, they do have means, and those 3 moves that I just mentioned, that's 30 mil, and that is actionable cap space for them this offseason and without many needs, because most of their starting lineup is back.
Yes.
You can conceivably talk yourself into them doing something big.
So a couple more things before we get to that. In terms of extensions.
Yes.
Do we assume Rousseau gets done?
No.
You don't think so?
No. So I asked Brandon Beane a very not like a super like, are you going to re-sign him sort of thing. I just asked him, what did you make of his year last year? Because he's such a confusing player. He has these stretches where he is just brilliant, and you're like, nobody's going to block that guy. And he's also a really good run defender. He was their most consistent defensive lineman last year. But then he just can't bring down the quarterback. And
this is called the Buffalo Bills.
I saw the smirk. You were Grinch smiling as we were going.
This is just the Buffalo Bills.
So,
like the confounding nature of Greg Rousseau is the Buffalo Bills in 2024.
Right. I mean, it's perfect. Rousseau, to me, and when I asked Brandon just to kind of lay it out, he's like, he was our most consistent defensive lineman. We still think he's on the ascent. We would like him to bring the quarterback down more, and we want him to be a double-digit sack guy. Now, where you have to be careful here, and this is why, to me, and I've written to this, I've spoken to this on my show too, it is so close to the Tremaine Edmonds conversation. It's almost perfect because they gave Tremaine Edmonds the fifth-year option. He's this huge height, weight, speed guy. The age factor, because Tremaine Edmonds was super young. That was always the book on him when they drafted. He was 19 when they brought him in. Greg Rousseau is going to be 26 when he hits free agency next year. And pass rushers with that type of ceiling, they get paid. We both know that.
That's kind of why I just assumed they would get it done.
Right, but it's a difficult thing because if you are projecting that he's going to get there, isn't that just setting yourself up for failure again? So that's why, to me, if we're talking about big moves, and I know we're getting closer to the topic, pass rusher to me is the end-all, be-all conversation.
Okay, so I like
here.
this.
Yeah.
The reason you don't do it is that it potentially cuts off paths to other moves.
Yes.
So what does that move look like?
I think they should go in on Myles Garrett if Cleveland will play ball. And I think there is enough evidence to what they need, the cap space that they could potentially have. And I guess it doesn't have to be Myles Garrett, just an impactful pass rusher that can come in and be like, okay, that guy needs to get double teamed and he makes everybody else better and he can still win even when he gets double teamed. Like, that is something they have been missing the entire Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane era outside of the first 11 or 12 games of 2022 before Von Miller tore his ACL. Like, they haven't had that person. They hoped Jerry Hughes would finally get there. That never happened. They hoped Rousseau would get to that level over time. His highest sack total in a year has been 8. His pressure rate has been awesome, but he's not bringing down the quarterback consistently enough. So I just think, to me, with how much emphasis they put on rushing only 4, not blitzing, zone coverage, and they went away from that in the playoffs because they had to, because they weren't getting pressure. And that was part of their puzzle. And the Chiefs absolutely roasted them as soon as they got to man-to-man coverage. Well, they were roasting them the entire game. But that's why, to me, when you look at what can make the heaviest impact, and we're talking about them on the cusp, what helps them get over the hump, if you have a star player at defensive end on the opposite side of the ball helping out Josh Allen, I think that is the single biggest sell. If we're talking about Garrett, same age timeline as Josh Allen, so it's perfect from that perspective. You're going to have to pay him, no doubt, but they have the cap space to do it. They have a lot of contracts they can get out of next year to help shoulder the blow.
They have a ton of flexibility next year.
Yep, and they have a ton of flexibility over the next few years. Some of that is going to evaporate because they just re-signed Shakir to an extension, but they also have Benford coming up. They have Bernard coming up. They have James Cook coming up. They have Rousseau coming up.
They also have Josh Allen coming up.
Yes, and that is something they're going to do within the next year, I would assume. But that's why, to me, it's such a star-aligning move when you think of cap space, where they are in their build, how they need that one piece to kind of get over the hump, how these players never become available. And even though the Browns are saying he's not available, I'm pretty sure he's going to be available at some point just because, at some point there has to be a decision made there. So to me, there's just so much evidence pointing toward being, if he can swing it, being able to make an aggressive move like this. Because the last time they had this type of team, this type of flexibility, this type of offseason, they went out and they signed Von Miller. So there's just a lot of similarities between 22 and 25 to me.
We talked about this last week with Dan Graziano, just the nature and the state of the Myles Garrett situation. And I think that I think they're really, really hesitant to deal him.
Yeah.
And I think that
would
the
be too.
price tag that would have to come along with this is exorbitant. And it's not as simple as like 2 ones. It's where are the ones, right? So the Bills are picking 30th overall. The Bills are going to be good next year. So the idea that you're going to get the 30th overall pick and the 27th overall pick for Myles Garrett, that doesn't get it done. I'm just telling you that right now. That doesn't get it done.
Yeah.
So I think that the pathways for the Bills specifically to do this are a little bit narrower because of where those picks are going to happen. I'm with you on the pass rusher move. The one I keep coming back to that I think is more realistic is Trey Hendrickson. Yeah. I think that one makes the most sense to me because I think right now, if you called the Bengals and you said, here is the Diggs trade second rounder, here is a fifth comp that we have, that could get it done. And so I think that to me feels more realistic, but I do think trying to shop in that aisle if you were the Bills is the right way to be thinking about it.
Yeah, it's what they were missing most from their defense last year, and it was good in spots, but it just wasn't good enough. They have a good enough coaching staff to get by almost everywhere else. The defensive backfield, they made it the entire way with Damar Hamlin as their starting safety last year, and that's borderline remarkable.
That's not going to happen again, I would assume.
No, he's a free agent, so he'll be gone.
And so that's my next question here. Yeah. No matter what happens at the edge rushing spot, I think even if you traded a couple picks for Trey Hendrickson, we still need solutions at safety and corner. So what do those solutions look like? Are those top of the market free agent solutions? Are they more modest investments than that? How would you rebuild those groups, and what do you think is the most realistic way that they're going to approach it?
I don't think they are going to touch safety with a resource because they believe strongly in Cole Bishop and what he showed down the stretch of the season. They got a good enough from Taylor Rapp last year to where they could, and he got better as the year went along too. So I think they have worked themselves into a spot where if they don't come away with something big at safety, they're going to be okay because Rapp is signed through 26, Bishop is signed through 27. So I don't think it's super pressing. Cornerback is more of a pressing one just because Rasul Douglas is a free agent. Kaiir Elam was an abject disaster in the playoffs, and it's a tough one. It was Bean's worst pick without question. It was Bean's worst first round pick. But they do need something along the cornerback lines, whether that's re-signing Rasul Douglas to a 1-year bridge deal, which I don't think is necessarily out of the question here. Him and Benford are super tight, and if they play philosophically the way that they want to, which is less man coverage, then Douglas is a perfect fit for that. Last year, him not getting an interception was such an anomaly. He was always around the ball. He always takes risks, everything like that. So I do think his season was a little misunderstood. So that's why I'm thinking bridge deal and then use one of your first or couple of seconds on a corner as your long term.
Interesting. So the way that I'm looking at the modest amount of flexibility they might have to add pieces, the edge rusher part of this is obviously the biggest one. Yeah. But potentially trying to upgrade that corner spot with some of the guys that are on the market, that was on my radar. You don't think that that's a reasonable route?
Only because they have been so good at getting the most out of cornerbacks.
Sure.
Dane Jackson started for them, and he just got cut by the Panthers.
But this is my concern.
I know.
Is that if we keep doing this, where we're we can turn a C+ into a B, and then you have a roster full of Bs, why is it going to end any differently next year than it ended this year?
Well, they believe they have an A that could become an A+ in Christian Bedford.
Sure.
And
I think that's fair.
Yeah, and he's been awesome since he walked in the door. And I don't know that they, especially with Taron Johnson on the roster, and as impactful as he is, I don't know that they're looking at cornerback as the be-all and end-all, this is what's going to take us to the next level. That's why I keep coming back to pass rusher more than anything, as to if they're going to take a big swing above all else. Look at what they got outside of Greg Rousseau from the edge rusher position. AJ Epinesa, his pressure rate, according to True Media and Pro Football Focus, was under 6 the entire year. He didn't play on third downs. They had to take him off the field. Dwayne Smoot was over, I think he was 6.8%, which is still not good. And Von Miller was only out there for rotational snaps. So you need something. Even if you commit to Rousseau, you need something that you can write home about, that will make Ed Oliver better, that will make Rousseau better, that will make the linebackers better, because there's not as much pressure on them to have to overperform week in and week out. So that's why, to me, if you're looking for, with limited cap space, that they can get more, but with limited cap space, the most impactful thing they could do is add a defensive end.
Is there anything on offense, or do you feel like status quo? Let's see how the young guys develop. We like our offensive line, obviously. Do you feel like staying the course there and just having your natural improvement from your young pieces is the move on that side?
I think they need a Z receiver, and I think they need one badly. They did not separate well last year outside of Shakir, and they are completely committed to Shakir playing slot, and that's his role. They got him on a steal of a contract extension, but mostly because they view him as a slot receiver. And so that's why, to me, they were missing. One thing I kept coming back to in that AFC Championship game is Brady did not have his best day, by the way. Joe Brady did not. But he was a little bit handcuffed in the fact that they weren't getting to the second level. They weren't separating on the second level consistently enough to where they could try and challenge them. And so how did he try to manufacture yards? There was a lot of outside the number screens at the line of scrimmage. I believe there were 7 or 8 in that game. The first one worked. The next 7 or 8 did not. And the yards per attempt on each one of those were not good. So that's why, to me, when you can have someone that can push down the field a bit more, and I'm not saying they have to go out and trade for Garrett Wilson or something, which I think would help them infinitely, but it's also not going to happen. If they were on the board and like a guy like Matthew Golden was there, I think you could absolutely work yourself into a logical argument to say, yeah, go get a receiver, complete the room. You've paid Shakir. Coleman isn't due for another 3 years. This Z receiver isn't due for another 4 years, and you're getting by at receiver without having to pay a big guy, and almost like a Green Bay model, only even with higher draft capital.
And also the quarterback is a different accelerant with the Bills than it is in Green Bay. We've talked a lot about this. I think that there's a lot of similarities from an approach standpoint, from a team building standpoint, and from a quality of roster standpoint for the other 21 starters in Buffalo as there is in Green Bay. The difference is the Bills have the second best player in the NFL, and the Packers have a quarterback who is good, but not the second best player in the NFL.
Yeah, no doubt. So that's why I think if you can get your hands on someone that can help punish a defense vertically and in the intermediate area a lot more consistently than what they got, because let's talk about the fact that Mac Hollins was getting more snaps than anyone in the playoffs. Like, that's when we met up at training camp, and we're both like, Mac Hollins is going to play a lot more people than people are comfortable with, and we were this was in August. Both you and I were like, oh gosh, this is going to be a thing this year. And it happened. Even after they traded for Amari Cooper, it continued.
It's always funny when, teams kind of overcorrect a little bit. And for years, we wanted this team to be more physical, more assertive, being able to tap into this, we can run the ball on our own terms sort of mentality.
Yeah.
And then they did that, and they leaned a little bit too far into it, because now it's Mac Hollins and that offensive line. When even if you want to be able to do that a little bit more, you still need the juice. You need to go get some of the juice. So yeah. I think this is all reasonable. I think that we fixed the Buffalo Bills in the last 25 minutes.
Yeah, it's that simple.
I'll
get by the Chiefs at Arrowhead next year.
I'll shoot Brandon a call, and I'll be like, just do all this stuff. And if you do all of this stuff just like line by line, you guys will get over the hump next year. So we'll just wait to see when the big edge rusher or defensive line move is coming, because I think we both think it needs to happen.
Yeah, no doubt.
Joe Buscaglia, always great to chat with you, sir.
You too,
great to see you, and we will do this again very soon.
Sounds good, my friend.
All right, guys, that's all we got today. Thank you so much to Derek. Thank you so much to Joe. Really enjoyed that. We will be back tomorrow doing the defense version of this show. Sincerely appreciate you guys listening. We'll talk to you very soon.